Delighted to be here today. I appreciate the invitation to present to you at this symposium. And let me clarify from the outset that this is a story about the South Carolina militia. But the story takes place in North Carolina, where we are always pleased to welcome visitors. Now, this title, Saving Colonel Williams, is intended to call to our minds the Steven Spielberg movie, Saving Private Ryan. That certainly suggests an ambitious goal for today's presentation. And although I am a poor substitute for Tom Hanks, at least we have your attention. Now, I say we, because I am only one voice in this continuing cause to save Colonel Williams. I add my voice today to the small chorus of investigators who have studied the life and career of South Carolina Militia Colonel James Williams, or at least parts of it. And my focus today is solely on his role of getting to the Battle of Kings Mountain. But in the telling of this story, we hope to help rectify the gross misdeed that was done to this patriot's reputation by his fellow South Carolina Militia Colonel William Hill. As many of you know, Billy Hill's memoir, which should never have been published, greatly disparaged the character of Colonel James Williams. And as Colonel Williams was mortally wounded at the Battle of Kings Mountain, he never had a chance to challenge and to correct the account of his Revolutionary War service. Now, principal among today's historians who have undertaken this cause, of course, is Will Graves. And many of you know him, of course, and you know his book, Backcountry Revolutionary. My presentation today simply adds to Will's cause, and I do so by looking at some new information. Information which Will Graves did not have available to him even the short time ago that he published his second book in 2012. And here's why. As some of you know, in part because it was mentioned briefly at last year's symposium, 3 independent scholars worked during 2015 to reveal a part of the Kings Mountain story which has until now been so well hidden. Bill Anderson, John Robertson, and I noodled out the details, and each of us separately published our findings. And today, I'm going to share that new story with you. It is the story of how a quarter to a third of the men who fought at Kings Mountain got there, the South Carolinians. But I am now adding for you today something else that can be learned from this research. And today is the first time that this new notion has been offered for consideration by such a learned group as this one. Now, when I read Colonel William Hill's suspect account of James Williams on his way to Kings Mountain, I knew that scholars acknowledged that Billy Hill wrote that account years later and in his dotage. And perhaps, like someone you may know, I fear that I am becoming more personally familiar with what dotage feels like. And I wondered this: how might the events of 1780 have unfolded such that Billy Hill remembered them the way he did? And to answer that question, I do not have to ascribe to Billy Hill any malicious intent. I just want to see if there is any honest, accountable, documented series of events which he could have seen from his singular and imperfect perspective, such that when he later recalled them, without full knowledge and perhaps with failing memory, he could have come up with the account that he did. And that is what I hope to share with you today, how the story could have unfolded so that Billy Hill would have recalled it later as he did. And we will get to that specific issue later in this presentation, but first, let me share the new history, which Bill Anderson, John Robertson, and I believe we have added to what is now known about the Kings Mountain story. And that story is told today almost exclusively celebrating the courage and commitment of the Over-Mountain men and the backcountry patriots of the Yadkin River Valley along the Over-Mountain Victory National Historic Trail. But the route of the militiamen gathering to fight at Kings Mountain now has a new footprint. A new footprint in communities who have never suspected that they have such an important connection to the Battle of Kings Mountain, the battle which turned the tide of the American Revolution. You see, as it turns out, the South Carolina militia marched as far as anyone else to get to a battle that was in their own backyard. Now, the Battle of Kings Mountain is that celebrated event that turned the tide of the American Revolution. It is commemorated today by 2 units of the National Park Service, the Kings Mountain National Military Park, and of course the Over-Mountain Victory National Historic Trail, which is 330 miles lying in 4 states, beginning up in Virginia and Abingdon, coming through today's northeast Tennessee, which at the time was North Carolina. And most of it lies in North Carolina, and it dips down into South Carolina. And when I share this story with audiences in North Carolina, I'm prone to suggest that when you look at the fact that what is now Tennessee was North Carolina, it is basically a North Carolina story. And if we can just get South Carolina to move their border a little south, we can have the whole thing. But I respect your claim to the site of the battle. Now, the story which many of you know, and in part, in order to get to what I want to talk about, I have to go quickly through the standard presentation that I have on the Battle of Kings Mountain. That alone takes 45 minutes, and I have less than that available today. But I will tell you this story by putting the story on the landscape. This is the story, the gathering of the militia, the Battle of Kings Mountain, and you will see that these sites, these place names are going to come up in the story. Abingdon was known as Abingdon in 1780. Sycamore Shoals is today's Elizabethton, Tennessee. Yellow Mountain Gap is where the Appalachian Trail and the Over-Mountain Victory Trail cross near today's Roan Mountain. Grassy Creek is near today's Spruce Pine. Quaker Meadows is in today's Morganton. Gilbertown was a frontier town outside of today's Rutherfordton, North Carolina. The ford at Green River is later known as Alexander's Ford, and that's out in the middle of nowhere in Rutherford County, real near the Polk County line. And then, of course, the Cowpens, which was the site of a later battle, and then the battle, the National Military Park. Now, as you know, in 1780, the Revolutionary War had come pretty much to a stalemate, and that's when the British decided to try for the second time their southern strategy. So they sailed out of New York. Sir Henry Clinton brought his ships and his British Legion, not British regulars, but some British regulars, but mostly American loyalists, and they came south to attack Charlestown, and Charlestown surrendered on May 12th of 1780. And with that, the entire southern department of the Continental Army under the command of Benjamin Lincoln was lost. And at that point, Sir Henry Clinton decided it was time for him to go back to New York, where he would find the amenities of that colony much more to his liking. So he put in command of the mop-up operation, the March North, because the southern strategy was to gather an army of loyalist Americans in the southern colonies to march north and attack George Washington from the south with an army of Americans. So he puts in command of that mop-up operation his second in command, Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis, a man whom Clinton despised, and the feeling was mutual. Well, before he left, Clinton knew that he would need someone to be in charge of rallying these militiamen to the cause, so he created a new position called the Inspector General of the Militia of Georgia and the Carolinas, and he assigned those responsibilities to a very capable and experienced officer, Major Patrick Ferguson. Well, in the summer of 1780, Cornwallis advances out of Charlestown, coming up the Wateree River and into the Catawba Valley, and in the wee hours of the morning of August 16th, the advance guard of Cornwallis bumps into the advance guard of the reconstituted Southern Department of the Continental Army under Horatio Gates. They separate and they come back together at dawn, and it is a colossal defeat for the Patriots. Horatio Gates abandons his men on the field and rides away for 3 days to Hillsborough, North Carolina. And at this point, there is no army standing between Cornwallis and his plans to march north and to attack George Washington from the south with an army of Americans, which obviously sets the stage for the militia to be the heroes in this story, which is why I'm being so dramatic about this. Now, as Patrick Ferguson is to the west, protecting Cornwallis's left flank, and he's advancing through the western part of South Carolina. And as he gets up into North Carolina, he has one of his officers, Lieutenant Anthony Allaire, is keeping a diary, and Anthony Allaire makes some entries about this experience, because at this point, the Patriot cause is in big trouble. And he writes, "The poor deluded people of this province begin to be sensible to their error, and they come in fast to pledge their allegiance to the British Crown." But as they got into the Catawba Valley, he made another entry. "This settlement is composed of the most violent rebels I ever saw, especially the young ladies." Well, for multiple reasons, by the time Ferguson gets up into North Carolina and at Gilberttown, he's had his fill of these pesky Patriot militiamen who had been coming over the mountains and sniping at him and then running away. So he takes a prisoner that he had captured at Musgrove Mills, the Battle of Musgrove Mills, and we're going to come back to that, and he sends him with a message to the Patriot militiamen who were in the Overmountain area, today's northeast Tennessee, and it was really a threat. And he said, "If you do not desist your opposition to the British arms, I shall march this army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste your country with fire and sword." So Patrick Ferguson made that threat, and that is what gives us the story of the gathering of the militia and their pursuit of Patrick Ferguson, which ends in the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, as I go through this very quickly, this is the abbreviated version, please pay attention to the dates, because you're going to see them again when I tell you this new history. On September 24th, the Virginia militia under Colonel William Campbell gathered at Addington, and they marched south. They gathered at Sycamore Shoals, where they were joined by 240 militiamen under Isaac Shelby, 240 militiamen under John Sevier. There were already 160 North Carolina militiamen there under Charles McDowell from Burke County and Andrew Hampton from Rutherford County, because they had attacked Ferguson at the Battle of Cane Creek and then escaped over the mountains to the safety of the Watauga River area. So on September 25th, you have a mustering of Overmountain militiamen. You've got 1,000 men on foot and horseback, and they're going to march over the mountains. On September 26th, they reach the base of the Appalachian Mountains on the west side. They have 500 pounds of gunpowder that's been given to them by Mary Patton, a gunpowder maker at Sycamore Shoals. It begins to rain, so they stick the gunpowder under shelving rock, and the next day they make their ascent up the west side of the Appalachian Mountains. When they cross at Yellow Mountain Gap, they get to the top, 5,000 feet elevation, and they find themselves standing in snow that was remembered as shoe-mouth deep. While they're up there, they fire their muskets, and the officers have the men count off, and they discover that there are 2 men that are missing, James Patterson and Samuel Chambers, 2 men who were thought to have loyalist leanings, and it was feared that these men had run ahead to warn Patrick Ferguson that this army of 1,000 men was coming over the mountains to attack him, but they had no choice but to continue. The next day, they marched along the Blue Ridge Plateau. They followed the North Toe River down to the mouth of Grassy Creek, and that today is Spruce Pine. They camped there. The next day, they descended the east side of the Blue Ridge Mountains, coming into the Catawba River Valley on September 29th. They had divided their men into 2 groups because there were 2 ways to come down the mountain, and they were afraid that they went down one, Patrick Ferguson might just come up the other, and then he would be behind them. And they had left only a small force to protect their homeland. Well, they gathered on September 30th at Quaker Meadows, the home of Charles McDowell and his brother Joseph McDowell in today's Morganton. And there they were joined by 350 militiamen that had come up the Yadkin River from Wilkes County and Surrey County under the command of Joseph Winston and Colonel Benjamin Cleveland. And now at Quaker Meadows they had 1,400 militiamen, and they knew that Patrick Ferguson was at Gilberttown. They knew that for a fact, and that's where they were headed. They left on October 1st. They crossed over at Greenlee Ford across the Catawba River, and they started marching up Silver Creek, and they got to Bedford Hill, and it had begun to rain. We think it must have been the remnants of a hurricane or a tropical storm that was passing through. It was raining so hard that they stopped marching. They remained at Bedford Hill on October 1st. It continued to rain. They remained there all the way through October 2nd. And on the morning of October 3rd, the Over-Mountain men and the backcountry patriots from the Yadkin River then marched down the Cane Creek to attack Patrick Ferguson, hoping to find him at Gilberttown. And on October 4th, they find themselves just outside of Gilberttown, and they discover that Patrick Ferguson is gone. Remember those 2 spies, James Crawford and Samuel Chambers? They had indeed come and told Patrick Ferguson that he was being pursued. Now, remember where we are leaving the Over-Mountain men and the backcountry patriots. It is October 4th, and they are just outside of Gilberttown, because there's another story. This is the story that I really came here today to share with you. As I pointed out, this is the Over-Mountain Victory National Historic Trail, which grandly celebrates the Over-Mountain men and the backcountry patriots. But this is the new story that I'm going to share with you today. This is a new footprint of the gathering of militia, how the South Carolina militia and the Lincoln County militia actually got to the battle. Now, in the next slide, you're going to see what is now shown screened in blue. You're going to see that image only. And you can see there's a great deal of movement that's represented here, and I want to share this story with you. And pay attention to the dates. Now here is the Catawba River that runs right through our story. It comes from Quaker Meadows, today's Morganton. It flows east, turns south. This is now Lake Norman, and now it comes down by Charlotte and into upstate South Carolina. As Cornwallis was approaching Charlotte, he sent his dragoons under Colonel Francis Lord Rowden to clear out any resistance that might be between him and Charlotte. And guess who was there? Well, it was Colonel Thomas Sumter. So he took his men from the east side of the Catawba River, and they crossed over at Baker's Ferry, and they did this on September 25th. Remember that September 25th was the same day that the Over-Mountain men were gathering at Sycamore Shoals. So on the day they're gathering at Sycamore Shoals, Thomas Sumter and his men are crossing at Baker's Ferry to the west side where they'll be protected. And on the 26th of September, they march north to Tuckasegee Ford. Now, if you've been up to the Charlotte area, you know where the U.S. National Whitewater Center is. That is at Tuckasegee Ford. And when he gets there, he discovers that Colonel William Graham of the Lincoln County Militia has been camping on the east side of the Catawba River at Tuckasegee Ford, and he's been there since September 5th because Patrick Ferguson was foraging over in Lincoln County, and so William Graham had taken the Lincoln County Militia across the river for protection. This is September 26th. And September 26th is the same day that Cornwallis entered Charlotte, and the Battle of Charlotte was taking place at the corner of Tryon Street and Trade Street at the same time that these men were 12 miles away at Tuckasegee Ford. On the 27th, you now have the Lincoln County Militia and the South Carolina Militia under Thomas Sumter marching north. They're on the east side of the Catawba River, and we think that they must have been going up Beatty's Ford Road. And they sent a messenger ahead to ask General William Lee Davidson, North Carolina Militia General, what should they do? And just to let him know that they were coming. Well, the express rider comes back from William Lee Davidson, and he says, there is a gathering of militia over at Quaker Meadows. And so now these Thomas Sumter and William Graham of the Lincoln County Militia know that they want to head toward Quaker Meadows. So they come up to Beatty's Ford, which is today submerged under Lake Norman. This is a historic quad sheet. If you've ever wondered what Beatty's Ford looked like, it was a crossing just at the end of a very long island. Well, on the next day, they crossed at Beatty's Ford. Now they're on the west side of the Catawba River, and they're marching north up to Sherrill's Ford. So now you have Thomas Sumter and William Graham camped out on the west side of the Catawba River on September 28th, which is the same day that the Overmountain men were just getting to Grassy Creek, which is today's Spruce Pine. Now, here's where things get really interesting. So stay with me. Go back a few days. September 23rd, Colonel James Williams has asked his Major Samuel Hammond to establish a muster site at Huggins Plantation, which is north of today's Charlotte, for a gathering of South Carolina militia and Georgia militia who have been separated from their units. So he wants this camp so that these soldiers can gather and be part of a force to go back into South Carolina and attack the British from behind. And Colonel Samuel Hammond issues a broadside as a call to arms, beef, bread, and potatoes. That was on September 23rd. Now, how did that come about, and how did James Williams get into this story? We have to go back to the Battle of Camden, August 16th. 2 days later, without knowing that the Patriots had been defeated at Camden, James Williams, Isaac Shelby, and Elijah Clark had attacked the Loyalist forces at Musgrove's Mill, a battle that you know well, on August 18th. Immediately after the battle, they got word of this defeat, and they were ordered to escape the area immediately. And they did escape, but they took with them 70 Loyalist prisoners. They rotated them. Every 3 Patriot soldiers would take a Loyalist soldier on the back of this horse, and they would rotate them. But they were being chased, and they barely escaped the upstate area. James Williams of South Carolina, Isaac Shelby of North Carolina's Overmountain area, and Elijah Clark of Georgia made an escape with these 70 prisoners up to Gilberttown. They conferred on what they ought to do, and they all decided they would stay in touch because it looked like the British were coming, and if they needed to work together, they would do so. But in the meantime, they would all go about their business. Elijah Clark goes back to Georgia. Charles McDowell had joined them because he was from Quaker Meadows. Isaac Shelby goes back to the Over Mountain area. And Andrew Hampton was also there from Rutherford County. Well, the only person left was James Williams, and he had been chased out of South Carolina, so they asked him to take the prisoners to Hillsborough. So James Williams, in late August, early September, takes these prisoners all the way to Hillsborough, September 5th. And he tells them about this victory at Musgrove's Mill. Well, he tried as best he could to share the honor of that victory with Isaac Shelby and Elijah Clark, but he was talking to politicians, and politicians being as they are, they just wanted to praise the person that was there, so they gave James Williams the lion's share of the credit for that victory. The South Carolina governor, John Rutledge, which, as you know, South Carolina did not call their executive a governor. He was known as the president. So President John Rutledge was in exile, and he was in Hillsborough. So he was delighted to see Colonel Williams there, and he gave him a special responsibility to gather an army of South Carolina militia and to go back to South Carolina and attack the British from behind. And he also gave James Williams a commission, some special powers for requisitioning supplies. So and the governor of North Carolina was Abner Nash, and he's there in Hillsborough. He joins in the lauding of James Williams, and he sends him up to Caswell County, North Carolina, to recruit men to serve in the South Carolina militia. So, in September, during the month of September, James Williams is up in Caswell County, where his brother lived. He had friends up there, and he's recruiting men to fight for the South Carolina militia. He sends Major Samuel Hammond back to the Huggins plantation to set up that encampment. And then, after James Williams gets a gathering of a few dozen men from Caswell County, he rides back toward Huggins plantation. He crosses over at the trading ford across the Yadkin River, and he goes through Salisbury. And there you can see, that's what the trading ford looks like today. And then he comes back to Huggins Plantation. He gets there on September 28th. And now he's got some South Carolina militia. He's got some men from North Carolina he's recruited there. And he's heading across the Catawba River so he can circle back and go into South Carolina. The very next day, he crosses at Sherrill's Ford. And who does he run into in camp but Colonel William Graham of the Lincoln County Militia and Colonel Thomas Sumter of the South Carolina Militia. Now, Colonel Thomas Sumter and Colonel James Williams are both South Carolina Militia colonels, and so they have a little tete-a-tete, a little conversation about who's going to be in charge. As it happens, this is on the morning of September 29th, Colonel Williams prevails. Colonel Sumter rides off to see President Rutledge in Hillsborough to get him to make him a general. So Thomas Sumter leaves with 5 of his officers. Meanwhile, Colonel Williams takes command of not only the men he's raised, but all of the South Carolina militia, all the privates that had been under Thomas Sumter. And he starts marching along the Catawba River, heading west. And he has 2 of Thomas Sumter's officers with him, Colonel William Hill and Colonel Edward Lacey. And they were there, not because they were necessarily supporting James Williams, but to look out for the interests of Thomas Sumter's men. So over the next 4 days, Colonel Williams is marching toward Quaker Meadows. Remember that by the time he caught up with Thomas Sumter, he also knew about this gathering of militiamen there at Quaker Meadows. And remember that it was raining on October 1st and October 2nd. So we know that that also impacted the rate at which James Williams and his combined forces could now march toward Quaker Meadows. And the next thing that we know happens, James Williams in camp on the night of October 2nd writes a letter to Horatio Gates telling him where he is and what he's intending to do and how many men that he has. And figuring out where he was camped was the key to having this entire story fall into place, because he said in his letter that he was 70 miles west of Salisbury in the forks of the Catawba in Burke County. And it was Bill Anderson who figured out where this could have been. And once we put that pin in the map, the rest of the story falls into place. Now, from that camp on October 2nd, William Chronicle, Major William Chronicle of the Lincoln County Militia, rode ahead to catch up with the Over-Mountain men. And because everyone else was in camp on October 2nd, the only way that he could have gotten to where he did by October 3rd was to ride through a driving rain. And I submit that that makes Colonel William Chronicle of the Lincoln County Militia and his men some of the hardiest rangers in this story. After Chronicle had left, somebody must have come back through the camp and told James Williams that the Over-Mountain men had already left to head toward Rutherford, because he takes his men down the east side of the South Mountains, which is a rugged land feature there in that part of North Carolina. So he's swinging to the east and the south of the South Mountains, and he makes his way over 2 days to an encampment area called the Flint Hills. It's not one peak, it's an area known as the Flint Hills. Now, meanwhile, the Over-Mountain men on October 4th, they have discovered that Patrick Ferguson is gone. So they write a letter to Horatio Gates asking what to do. And in this letter, they do not mention Patrick Ferguson. They are simply asking, we've got a big army here, send us a general, send us somebody that can lead us into command, somebody to command us and lead us into service for the patriot cause. And the person who carries that letter is Colonel Charles McDowell. That letter was signed by William Campbell, Isaac Shelby, John Sevier, Andrew Hampton, Benjamin Cleveland, and Joseph Winston. And Colonel Charles McDowell is going to carry that letter all the way to Hillsborough. On October 4th, after Charles McDowell had left with that letter, we find that William Graham arrives at the encampment of the Over-Mountain men, and he's also catching up with his subordinate, Major William Chronicle. Now, on October 5th, Colonel Charles McDowell leaves the encampment just outside Rutherford, and he's riding all the way to Hillsborough. And whose encampment does he ride through? Miracle of all miracles. He comes through the Flint Hills, and he stumbles into Colonel James Williams. And that's how Colonel James Williams learns about the Over-Mountain men having lost the trail of Patrick Ferguson. They don't know which way Patrick Ferguson has gone, and they are looking for a leader. So Colonel James Williams and his associate Colonel Thomas Brandon ride from the Flint Hills over to the Over-Mountain men near Gilbertown. And they agree. They make a pact. They agree. James Williams says, look, I've been told to go into South Carolina and to attack them from the south. Why don't you guys come with me? And all of the officers, must have agreed with James Williams that this was a good idea. They didn't know where Ferguson had gone, so now they've agreed they're going to go into South Carolina, they're going to attack and menace the British from behind. So James Williams and Thomas Brandon then ride back to the Flint Hills to get their men ready to march south on October 5th. Meanwhile, the Over Mountain men are heading out of the valley where they were. There we go. Out of the valley where they were, because they had agreed to meet at the old ironworks on Lawson's Fork, which is in today's eastern Spartanburg County. And to get there from where everyone was, they knew that they would have to go through the cow pens. So they have agreed already to meet at the cow pens the next night. The Over Mountain men figured that the best way for them to get there was to get out of this valley and get on this ridge road that would take them down to the cow pens as quickly as possible. So that's why they headed to the southwest. Well, when James Williams gets back to his encampment at the Flint Hills, he discovers that Colonel William Hill and Edward Lacey had a spy, a South Carolina spy, come in and tell them that he now knew where Ferguson was going, that he was heading east toward Charlotte. So here comes James Williams back into his encampment, and he's being told that now we have found Patrick Ferguson. And this gets back now to the dotage thing. The traditional telling of the story by William Hill, as he wrote later, is that James Williams had ridden to see the Over Mountain men to trick them into going into South Carolina, because he, James Williams, had property down there, and that they were going to go down there and plunder Tories. So that's how Colonel William Hill maligned the character of James Williams. His telling of the story is that he, William Hill, got into an argument with James Williams about what they were supposed to do, and that he, William Hill, asked Edward Lacey to ride and find the Over Mountain men and tell them to ride to the cow pens so they could gather and attack Patrick Ferguson. Well, the fact is they were already going to the cow pens. And that was part of what was unfolding and already planned. So on the night of October 5th, Edward Lacey, with a guide, is riding through the countryside looking for the Over Mountain men. He finds them at the ford on Green River, and he tells them, we have found Patrick Ferguson, but you guys are going to have to pick up the pace a little bit. You're slacking it. So that's when the Over Mountain men divided their force into those who had horses and those who could get them by morning, and the foot soldiers. And so on October 6th, the Over Mountain men, the men that had horses, rode for 22 miles to get to the cow pens. Meanwhile, the foot soldiers followed. James Williams and his men on October 6th marched south. They crossed the island ford on the Second Broad River, and they arrived at the cow pens. So now you have the Over Mountain men and James Williams with his South Carolina militia, many of which were Tom Sumter's men, gathered at the cow pens. And on that night, the officers walked through they had another spy come in and tell them that Patrick Ferguson was still 27 miles away. And they realized that the only way that they had to catch him the next day, because if he got any closer to Charlotte, he would be within the protection of Cornwallis's larger army. So these men had been in the saddle for 2 weeks. They had been in the saddle just for 22 miles that day, and they realized the only thing they could do was to ride all night long. So they went through the encampment. The officers picked the 900 best marksmen. They put them on the 900 sturdiest horses. And at 8 o'clock at night, they rode out into a cold, dark October night. And it began to rain. They took off their hunting frocks and wrapped them around their rifles to keep their powder dry. They rode through the night being confused by the rain and the mud. They crossed the rising Broad River, and on the morning of October 7th, they crossed over the Broad River
They pursued information. They stopped at one house and they asked the men there, where was Patrick Ferguson? They were no help, but they were about to ride away. And a young girl came up to them, and whether she was impressed by one particular soldier or the 900 on horseback, we don't know. But she went to William Campbell and she said, how many of you are there? Enough to whip Ferguson if we can find him. And she pointed toward Little Kings Mountain and said, he is upon that hill. Well, these men rode on. They got within a quarter mile of the mountain. They had not been seen. They stopped and they tied up their horses. They tied up their hunting frocks and their blankets. And they took with them into battle only what they would need: their rifles, their shot, their powder, their tomahawks, and their hunting knives. The final command went out. Put fresh prime in your guns, boys, and every man go into battle resolved to fight until he dies. They broke into two columns and they encircled the mountain. And they charged up the mountain 3 times, being repelled twice by the loyalists with their bayonets at the top. But on the 3rd time, they made it to the top and they killed Patrick Ferguson, and they killed or captured all of his men, destroying 1/3 of Cornwallis's army. Now, Colonel James Williams was mortally wounded late in that battle. He died the next day as they made their retreat from the Battle of Kings Mountain, fearing that Bannister Tarleton and his dragoons were coming out to rescue Patrick Ferguson, and they didn't want to be overtaken by Bannister Tarleton. Colonel James Williams was buried along Buffalo Creek, and then in the 1900s his body was removed and reinterred and put in the lawn of what is now a public administration building in Gaffney, South Carolina, but at the time was a Carnegie library. And back on October 7th, 1780, a day before the battle, too late and too far away to be of any consequence in the matter at hand, Colonel Thomas Sumter was made Brigadier General in Hillsborough. Now, the valor of these men at the Battle of Kings Mountain is remembered, and there's one particular commemoration I want to point out to you. On July 4th, 1814, Dr. William McLean, at his own expense, erected a monument commemorating some men who died on that day from his neighborhood on the South Fork of the Catawba River in today's Gaston County, North Carolina. And that monument, erected on July 4th, 1814, is the 2nd oldest Revolutionary War monument in the country. Now, it was made out of blue slate, and it eroded terribly. You can barely see any of the inscription on it today. But 100 years ago, in 1914, the inscription was repeated on this granite marker, and you can see the pair today at Kings Mountain. The Catawba River Valley in North Carolina now has footprints for the Battle of Kings Mountain. And indeed, we have a new muster site. The men that were mustering there were South Carolina militia. And indeed, this new story is about how the South Carolina militia got to the Battle of Kings Mountain. And indeed, they walked as far as anyone else to get to a battle that was in their own backyard. And that's the new story that I wanted to share with you today. Question? How much time do we have?
About 5 minutes.
Oh, good. Yes, sir.
With your new findings, do you expect that the National Park Service will expand the over mountain victory trail?
The question relates to whether or not the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail will eventually incorporate this. I don't know. They've been very busy celebrating their centennial this year. I doubt that they even know this history yet. This new. It's brand new. And some of you have already purchased my book, Before They Were Heroes at Kings Mountain. I have this today. This is 6 years of Revolutionary War history leading up to and including the Battle of Kings Mountain. And I wrote this book so that you could see why these militiamen were uniquely qualified to do this heroic thing. So it's 6 years of Revolutionary War history going. It starts in 1774. Some of the same men who fought at Kings Mountain were campaigning down the rugged Kanawha River to fight under Colonel Andrew Lewis against Chief Cornstalk and the Shawnee at the Battle of Point Pleasant. So you'll see how these men prepared themselves. The story that I just shared with you, this new history, has been added as a final chapter, not final, the last chapter of this book. This is a second edition. This is a guide to the Over Mountain Victory National Historic Trail. So if you want to see the maps and read the history that I just shared with you about how the South Carolina militia got to the battle, including this map and that story, that is in this. They make a good, perhaps a good pair. Let's see. These, if you'll come out there to my table, you'll see these books. I'm going to ask for more questions in a second. I want to make sure I get through this. I've got some other books out there that are very interesting. This is Rebecca Boone's story. This is one of the few treatments we have of a woman's experience of the pioneer life, so you may want to come out and look at that. This is all North Carolina history that was written 40 years ago, and indeed the book I have out there has been in his widow's basement for 39 years. And all of my books that may be of interest to you or somebody you know, just a reminder, the season is upon us. We have to do this. Thank you very much. Any other questions about what I presented?
Mayor,
Yes, sir.
how many men were involved on both sides of that kingdom?
How many men involved on both sides?
How many men involved in both sides on Kings Mountain? And about 1,000, about 1,100 were at the battle. There were 900 Patriot militiamen, and Patrick Ferguson had about 1,100 men. Now, it's important to know that everybody that was on that mountain, with the exception of Patrick Ferguson, was an American. It was loyalist against patriot. Patrick Ferguson was the only non-American on that battlefield. And so that's an important thing. No, yes, ma'am.
Okay, we were in North Carolina near Black Mountain, where you can see where everybody went over about 5 years ago, in a big orchard of apple trees, and there was about 23 different kinds. And we got to the guy that was running it. His family's been there since before the Revolution, and told the story of how the man came up and said, "How are you going to be beat?" and left all the walking soldiers behind to pick up as many as like you said, the ones that were on the horses left them. So they arrived at Kings Mountain in the middle of the battle. They didn't get really, the story that was told, they caught up as all these other things and plans had been in session, came at the right time with their pitfalls and their little things, so that the men were in the middle of the battle very hungry. So I mean, it was just very, many fortuitous things happened by the folks that were walking from the middle of North Carolina to catch up with all these nice fine people that had horses.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. She's referring to the orchard at Alta Pass. It's up on the Blue Ridge Parkway. You have just 1 week to go up there and visit before they close for the season. But he has this wonderful orchard, and this is a nonprofit organization. But Bill Carson is the man who saved that orchard, and he's still involved in it. He is a direct descendant of Robert Young, the militiaman who is credited with shooting Patrick Ferguson on the day of the battle. And when Bill Carson saved that orchard, he did not know it. So he tells an incredible story. And by the way, Bill Carson, he worked for IBM, and his job was to implement GPS. So, remarkable fellow. Yes, sir. Oh.
slate marker you notice back at Kings Mountain for Dr. William McLean. His wife was Mary Polly Davidson. They're my third great grandparents on my mother's side.
Thank you, sir. All right, I will be glad to answer questions individually back at my table, but it's now time for your break. I thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the story. Thank you.